Well, hello there. It's June 3rd, 2025. This is lecture 27 for spring 2025 semester. And yes, um, I hope you haven't gotten sick of my voice yet because if you have, you're in luck because this is the last lecture of this class. It's going to be a review session. I'm going to go through the pretty much every concept in the book. At least touch on it real quickly. And this is going to be a great place for you to watch this video um, when you're organizing your thoughts for the final exam. As we go through this, I'm not going to explain the concepts. I'm just going to mention them, maybe a couple points to go along with them. There's more information on the slides. You can download the slides. But the gist of this is if you recognize the concept and you know the general idea of the concept, then you're in a good place. Um, if you don't recognize the concept or you're vague on the topic itself, then you need to do some research and prepare. Because this class is built around, as we know, the common body of knowledge for the healthcare information security and privacy practitioner certification, which you probably also know has sunsetted, but this class is a requirement for your cybersecurity healthcare specialist um, certificate that you can earn from Moreno Valley College. So we'll talk about that at the very end. But here are our 6 domains. And to be fully honest about the history of this exam went through an update in 2019. So the study guide is based on the original certification domains, which were 6. And then from there, it got updated to 7. You can see the breakdown here of the percentages of domain questions. So for domain 1, which is healthcare industry, 12% of the exam questions were from that domain. Then they took domain 4 and they kind of broke it up into domain 2, which is information governance for healthcare, which is only 5% of the exam. And they took risk management and they moved it down into domain 6. So now that became 20% of the exam, but it kind of became an amalgamation of the information risk assessment, which is a lot of NIST SP 830, as well as risk management, which is also a lot of NIST SP 830, as well as 39. You've been through all that already. So my general thought here is that I am doing my best to have the certification exam, which is 80 questions over 2 hours. The actual exam is 125 questions over 3 hours. So based on these percentages in 2015, I'm going to be close to that. I might not be exactly 15% for domain 4 or 8% for domain 2. As a matter of fact, privacy and security got such a healthy bump in 2019 that probably there'll be more than just 8% healthcare questions. But rest assured, there won't be more than 80 questions, and it'll be broken down in mostly, these percentages. So clearly, information risk assessment is a big one. And domain 5 is heavily pulling from NIST 830. So that lecture, if you watched it already, I already emphasized that that's the most important lecture to watch. We'll get into all of that. For comparison, though, all of you should be on a journey where you're trying to become a certified information system security professional. And these are the domains that are part of that particular exam. Now, that exam requires a minimum of 5 years of cumulative experience, and they want the experience to be actually in two or more of the domains. And if you earned a post-secondary degree, bachelor's or master's, then you can actually probably replace a year of requirement for experience. Um, but they also state that candidates don't have to have the required experience to become a CISSP certified. What happens is you become an associate of ISC2 by successfully passing the CISSP. So if you think that you got all the knowledge you need and you don't have the experience yet, then you're more than welcome to take the exam still. They'll take your money, probably around $600. If I may, though, as students, there is discounts for the CompTIA side, and there may be discounts for the ISEC people as well. So look into that. I know for sure on the CompTIA side. And then ISEC has their CC2, which is free. And I may have mentioned that earlier in the class, but if you're not aware of it, the initial certification for the ISC2 foundation is the CC2, which you can sign up for and get the training and take the exam for free. So, but to get back to my point, you can become an associate of ISC2 and take the CISSP, and then you have 6 years to earn the requirements. So it's a great way to have the actual knowledge represented. You just don't have the experience yet. Okay, so let's get started here. This is actually being recorded on the evening of June 3rd, and we have thunderstorms in the area. It's refreshing. Hopefully, you folks will watch this and the thunderstorms will be gone. But let's get started. So if you hear thunder in the background, that's what you hear. Okay. So domain one, healthcare industry, right? So this one starts off with healthcare systems. It kind of defines that there's a number and variety of ways for healthcare to be delivered, whether it's from an individual physician to a global pharmaceutical company, government agencies, regulators, at all different levels, local, state, federal, international. So it kind of rounds out all of that. And then it goes in to talk about healthcare organizations. There's a wide variety of them, but they're mostly classified by for-profit and not-for-profit, right? So delivery of high-quality healthcare services at a low cost when organizations form and handle everything under one roof. So then it talks about healthcare providers. This is an organization that provides medical or health services, furnishes or bills or pays for healthcare in the normal course of business. So if in normal course of business it's involved in the healthcare, it's a healthcare provider. Organized physician services, it talks about that. There's a definition there. And then we have the NPI, the National Provider Identifier, which is a unique 10-character identification number. You should be aware of this already. It's handled by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and it's also part of the National Plan and Provider Enumeration System. The pharmaceutical industry is mentioned under healthcare industry, heavily regulated, I think were the main points there. And it doesn't deliver medicine directly to the patients, right? It goes through a pharmacy, usually. Now, the payer is defined as the entity other than the patient, so maybe the health insurance company, and is involved with finance or reimbursing the cost of healthcare services. And this could happen on insurance company side, but it also happens in the government and contractor side as well. EDI is mentioned, electronic transfer of information in standard format. So the electronic data interchange is a concept that you need to be familiar with. Value-added networks, where these are intermediaries between business partners that help to provide value to the customer by handling all of the transactions of information between different healthcare providers. Right. Health insurance exchanges. These are centralized offerings for individuals without insurance. So this came from the Affordable Care Act. So exchanges where people can go and get health insurance, and the health insurers are basically in competition on these exchanges. This is where we first also get introduced to the term business associate, which is a business that provides support or activities for healthcare delivery, includes claim processors, consultant, transcription services, um, and they also must safeguard patient information. HIT, health information technology, is defined in the healthcare industry's domain. Exchange of health information, improves the quality of healthcare is a big goal of health information technology. This includes things like EMRs, health medical records. So this technology basically provided more value and made things more profitable and more efficient for the healthcare industry. Medical devices were also mentioned here. Be familiar with those. Um, Meaningful use regulations. This was part of the initial exam, the first midterm. This is all about providing incentives for organizations to use electronic health records and to adopt certain technologies. If they do so, then they actually get benefits or get discounts from Medicaid, Medicare. Electronic health records, the EHR. They like to use the word longitudinal electronic record of patient of information because it's across all of the different providers of healthcare information, right? So it doesn't only include healthcare information, it's demographics, the notes, it's all in one central area. Then we get to protected health record, right? So this is managed by the patient, not the provider. So the patient logs in and, excuse me, personal health record. So this is used to store and monitor their health information. They can log in and they can change it. Maybe this is associated with a sports watch or a diet plan, but it's still considered a personal health record. Health insurance is defined in this section: public or private programs, Medicaid, Medicare, employer programs. Payment models: this is a reimbursement for specific individual services, payment for specific care, coordinated, incentive for achieving measurable goals. So be familiar with the payment model. Healthcare coding, be familiar with why we code things, the purpose of coding it. Get familiar with SNOMED if you haven't already, as a core terminology for the electronic health record. And just be familiar with the concept and how it's used, specifically, obviously, part of medical billing. All right, so HIPAA also has transaction codes. Be familiar with the basic codes that are presented in the study guide. Know what the National Uniform Billing Committee does. What do? They handle uniform billing and they oversee the code sets. Clearinghouses. Healthcare clearinghouse helps process non-standard standard data into standard elements. Transcriptors are a big part of this, where they're taking information from the doctor's office and putting it into information that are standard elements, and they are usually working for a healthcare clearinghouse. Be familiar with workflow management. Does that a concept itself, and how workflow management impacts how information is handled. The regulatory environment is introduced here. Public health reporting, recognize the legitimate need for health information. This is a big part of permitting disclosure without authorization. Clinical research is also discussed in this section here. Protect the rights and safety of the subjects whose information is being used in the clinical research. Authorization and informed consent is a big part of this industry, and it is introduced here in this particular domain. Institutional review boards is another concept that you need to be aware of. They ensure critical activities and best practices as they oversee that organizations are using information correctly making sure they're compliant with applicable laws. Healthcare records management is another concept that's introduced here in this particular chapter. Data sharing, properly safeguarded under HIPAA rules. 5 agreements of the healthcare industry. So if you're not familiar with those, go understand those. Understanding external third-party relationships. So a lot of these concepts we drill down on later, but they're all initially introduced here. The information flow and life cycle, we will talk about that. Health data characterization. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements. So health data is defined better in this healthcare industry as part of the healthcare industry. So risk classification based on data sensitivity, right? So we drill down on all this. This is the beginning of our overall journey into healthcare information security and privacy. Healthcare provider taxonomy codes. Be familiar with the code sets that are part of this particular subject. No data analytics in general, scientific or mathematical analysis of business intelligence, right? So this leads organizations to have greater efficiency, but we have to make sure that this data is safeguarded, right? So we get into that later on with de-identification and anonymization. Data interoperability and exchange, so exchange across clinical, lab, and hospital pharmacy. So the main thing here is to know the concept that this is an important part of the healthcare industry. Okay, and integrating the healthcare enterprises, so coordinated use of established standards that helps healthcare organizations communicate through these standards that have been set up through usually the HIPAA requirements or different organizations in the federal level. The Health Level 7 International, this is a framework for exchange of management of e-health information. Be familiar with that. DICOM for digital imaging and communication medicine, and legal medical records, all right? So we need to make sure that our medical records meet statutory and regulatory requirements, including access, privacy, and confidentiality policies. I just heard a big thunderstrike there. I don't know if you heard it or if it's being weeded out through my noise cancellation, which we should all be probably familiar with. Okay, so domain 2, regulatory environment. So now we get into the really thick stuff here of HIPAA. HIPAA comes into play finally. So HIPAA protects the privacy of individuals' identifiable health information, sets national standards, requires notification following a breach. Administrative simplification becomes introduced as part of HIPAA, which includes standards for privacy, security, and enforcement. Health information means any information, whether it's oral or recorded in any form or medium, needs to be protected. That's health information. Relates to past, present, or future physical or mental health of an individual. Excuse me, physical or mental health. So some select elements are presented in this chapter. Health information means any information. We talked about that. Created and received by a healthcare provider or plan or a clearinghouse. Individually identifiable health information includes demographic data. So if health information is tied to demographic data, then it is protected as well. Reasonable basis to believe information can identify the individual must be protected. And protected health information excludes education or employment records. Okay, so these particular HIPAA CFRs, I want you to make sure that you're familiar with. All right, so if you want to discuss with someone the security rule, it's under Part 164, security and privacy. If you want to know about administrative safeguards, 164.308, physical safeguards, .310, technical safeguards, .312. Please be familiar with those. All right, and then it goes in to talk about the ARRA Act, which implemented the final breach notification rule, strengthened the civil and criminal enforcement of HIPAA. So just be familiar with that act. That's what it did. International standards. So the book goes into international standards. I think you just need to know the most important ones that are mentioned in the book. Just know the jurisdiction. That's the main thing I'd like to make sure you know. Right. And then it talks about a culture of privacy and security. So this is the concept that um, the organizational culture dictates how privacy and security is handled. We talked a lot about that. Organizational level privacy and security requirements, PHI, protected health information must be collected for a specific purpose, kept isolated from authorized persons, deleted when no longer needed. So these concepts, make sure you're familiar with that. The data breach regulations under 164, 400 to 414, be aware of that. Penalties and fines. You don't need to know the exact numbers, but know that they do exist and that the ARRA increased them. De-identification standard here under 164.514. Be familiar with this. Information flow mapping, just the concept, how managed data information flows is the utmost importance. So as cybersecurity professionals, we need to know how to look at data flow and manage data flow. Mapping is critical. We've learned that skill through our projects. Monitoring protected health information flows, so it needs to be monitored constantly. Report any breaches, and then the jurisdictional implications there. So all regulatory level stuff, right? So the DURSA. Now, this is something that didn't come up in our final domain when we talked about third party, but it's something that you need to know because it basically is a agreement that has been created by the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT so that you have a basis for how agreements are set up between parties that are handling healthcare information. Are you familiar with that? Know the concepts of data subject, data ownership, and legislative and regulatory updates. Basically, this is that everything is changing constantly and everything needs to be revised to reflect the changes. And of course, assessments also are part of that, which we get into later. Treaties, know the concept of treaties and how safe harbor privacy principles guide international transfer. Safe harbor privacy principles is a concept you need to know. We go into that further. Industry specific laws. Now, these are like the OSHA Act, which handles the workplace, PCI DSS, which handles payment card transactions, and then SOX, which handles corporate responsibility and fraud prevention. So these all still impact healthcare organizations. Policy, procedure, standards, and guidelines. Know the difference between all of them, what a policy is, procedure is, a standard is, a guideline, right? You know that already, I'm sure. Okay, so common security frameworks, right? No frameworks, all right? So choose frameworks suited to specific requirements. Hybrid approach often recommended. We maybe find ourselves between different frameworks. But the bottom line here is you use the framework to ensure that protected health information is safeguarded. So ISO is an international framework. Be familiar with that. NIST is the US centric standard, and we have SB 866, the HIPAA security rule, which is considered a framework, but it sits within the cybersecurity framework from NIST. And then we're familiar with NIST interagency reports. All right, and then the common criteria, which is an international organization. It has certified product categories. I think that's the main thing to be familiar with there. Trusted computed products with digital signatures. Information Governance Toolkit, which is a UK NHS thing. And then this one, be familiar with the GAP. Of course, this is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, as well as the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. They formed GAP, and it is grounded in 12 general privacy principles. Right, so this is agreements founded in general privacy principles, which later became part of cybersecurity agreements between organizations that work across the Canadian-American border. USA border. Okay, and then high trust, all right? Familiar with the Health Information Trust Alliance, bases this program on the Common Security Framework, harmonizes federal, third-party, and government requirements. Know the SANS critical security controls, a subset of the NIST SP 853 controls. Just be familiar with that concept. It's basically the 20 most critical controls that organizations must have. Then we get introduced into risk-based decision making. So in the regulatory environment, they want organizations to make risk-based decisions based on doing what? Risk assessments, right? And risk management. So they just introduced the concept here. Be familiar with the concept. Compensating controls, right? So what are compensating controls? They addressed controls that the primary control failed or didn't quite cover all the risks, and we wanted into compensating controls, right? So part of the support, part of the defense in depth approach. Sorry, we have a lot of concepts here, and I want to make sure I don't run too long for you. We're on slide 44, and we have a bunch to go. Here we go, control variance documentation, right? So this is documenting variances in the control. So it must align with privacy security controls. So familiar with the concept there. Residual risk tolerance, all right? So organizations must accept a certain level of residual risk, right? We can't stop all risk. So what level would that be? And then the book talks about the organizational code of ethics. Be familiar with that, specifically the code of ethics when it comes to the ISC2. Almost every exam that is handled by the ISC squared people has something about their code of ethics, and it also talks about their sanctions. All right, domain 3, privacy and security. Okay, so this is the one that grew dramatically between two iterations here. So it may have more questions than you think. So, but be very familiar with privacy and security in healthcare. Let's face it, that is the main gist of our certification. And it starts off with security fundamentals of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which you're familiar with. Know them. Know the concepts of defense in depth or the layered approach. Avoiding a single point of failure is a big part of that. Um, Layered controls. If one fails, there's another one that's they have to get through to get to the corporate jewels we're trying to protect. Then it goes into access control, right? So this is our primary control. You know, basically only authorized individuals should access information. This is physical and logical access, builds on the defense in depth. The main thing to know here is our discretionary user, our mandatory access, and our role-based access. So be familiar with those three, right? You're already familiar with administrative, physical, and technical controls. They echo throughout the access control concept. Data encryption, right? So this is a foundational component of healthcare security, encrypting our data. It's required under the HIPAA security rule. Be familiar with that. Be familiar with the concept of secret, public, and hash keys, which would go on this slide here. Secret key is the same key used to encrypt and decrypt. Public key has two different keys, the encrypt key and the decrypt key, the private key and the public key. Be familiar with that. You do not share the private key, but the public key is shared. Hash functions, all right, so this is basically just supports integrity. It's a one-way algorithm, so be familiar with hash functions. Training and awareness, all right, know that it's one of the most powerful tools and most cost-effective ways to provide cybersecurity to your organization. Be familiar with training and awareness. Logging and monitoring, be familiar with those concepts. A systematic activity review based on thresholds. HIPAA requires audit controls and login monitoring. That's most important there. Vulnerability management, just know the concept, right? So we're identifying and remediating vulnerabilities. It's a continuous process supported by HIPAA compliance. And then, of course, security awareness and training is part of vulnerability management. Systems recovery. right? So this is where we get into ensuring availability of electronic protected health information that it can quickly recover. Just know the concept here. We get further into this later on. Know the five contingency plan implementation standards, disaster recovery plan, restore any loss of data. Know the concepts behind system recovery. No segregation of duties, right? So sensitive job functions performed by separate people, right? System of checks and balances, reduce the risk of abuse, know the concept of change control and configuration management, right? So if we don't have configuration management in place, it reduces vulnerabilities if not managed. It ensures a consistent and secure state. All right, then we have business continuity, which is part of system recovery. So business continuity is ensuring critical business functions operate during an incident, right? No business continuity, obviously. Disaster recovery supports short and long-term recovery after disruption, and focus on critical systems needed in a timely manner, right? So we did kind of discuss this um, further on, but here it is introduced initially. Backup strategy, part of that. So what is your backup strategy? Know the backup procedures, who, what, when. Critical application assessment, determine essential systems that need to be backed up. Know the methods of backup: full, incremental, differential, mirrored. Hybrid on-site, remote approach. Know that particular strategy. All right. Alternate sites, hot sites, cold site, warm sites. Know all that. Data retention and destruction, right? Remove electronic protected health information before media is reused. Be aware of these concepts here. The 12 general privacy principles are introduced here, right? So know these concepts. This is the backbone of everything else. So just focus here, and all of the other privacy standards, just be familiar with them, but know the 12 here. All right. Be familiar with the concepts that are associated with these. Okay, the relationship between privacy and security. This is the balance between um, your data and logging access, and then making sure that the logged access does not become abused, right? So I think that that was a big part of this section here. All right, disparate nature of sensitive data and handling implications, right? So this talks about the type of data that's in the healthcare industry and the importance of data classification and handling procedures, because data can be a variety of things, everything from images to doctor notes to demographics. So recognizing that, right? Protected health information then becomes its own introduced section here, and defined by HIPAA. So first of all, PHI is any information in the medical record, right? So no protected health information. It can be used to identify an individual, created, used, or disclosed in healthcare delivery. So any information by an organization that's part of healthcare delivery is protected health information. All right, so HIPAA outlines 18 identifiers, right? Data sets and identifiers can change context. This is a big concept, right? It can change context and must be protected when associated with healthcare data. So if the data sets is associated with healthcare data, it becomes protected healthcare information. Here are the 18 identifiers. You got to know these. You have to be familiar with these. All right. That's so if any of these are become an issue in any way in a question that needs to be protected, right? The way you protect it is to de-identify it, right? So you can take information, and if it's de-identified, and then you can use that health information. One, under safe harbor, it's the actual removal of the 18 personal identifiers, right? If an expert determination has the ability for an expert to remove the information and determine that no reasonable basis to believe that it can be identified. So those are the two approaches. Data anonymization, right? Data can be used in data-driven research. So this has to be very used carefully because of the risk of reverse engineering or de-anonymization. So be familiar with that. And mental health data is explicitly covered under HIPAA as something that must be protected. And that includes substance abuse, pregnancy, that's still protected, but not implicitly. HIV research is now protected, and DNA is not named, but is treated as protected health information. The other thing here was that certain business functions use health data for administrative responsibilities or fiscal accounting data or for insurance data. So it too needs to be protected. All right, moving on to domain 4 here. Information governance and risk management, chapter 5 of the study guide. So here we get introduced to NIST, and we get some general information about NIST and the different publications that NIST puts out. We also get introduced to ISO in more detail here and recognized across the world. So if you're dealing with an international healthcare organization, you're going to need to be familiar with ISO. NHS is the United Kingdoms, and so that concept is introduced there, and their information government life cycle and some minimum requirements. Be familiar just with the jurisdiction, right? If you're dealing with something in England, then it's NHS, right? If you're dealing something with Canada, then it's probably dealing with GAAP. All right, understand security and privacy governance. So these, when we start to introduce the concept of information governance as a structure of policies, processes, procedures, behaviors, and technologies. So it's the actual governance of the security and privacy programs, right? So these programs are designed to manage information throughout its life cycle, right? So supported by administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. So we start to bring all of the information under one thought of how do we govern the security and privacy of protected health information. We do it through layers of protection, defense in depth. We define roles and responsibilities, engage stakeholders. Governance includes accountability and strategic oversight. So it's the general concepts there. Then we talk about roles and responsibilities. And there's only two that I really want you to make sure that you're aware of. The CEO, right? So the CEO is involved with overall responsibility, right? Must protect against risks that could harm organizational operations and assets, individuals, maybe other organizations that you do business with, or the nation as a whole, all need to be considered by the CEO. Then we have our CISO or CISO, also known as Senior Information Security Officer. So be familiar with this particular one, and it kind of gives you an emphasis of what the role is in government, must handle FISMA responsibilities, but also can be the primary liaison between other officials in the organization. And then there's the authorizing official. This can be anybody who's authorized to sign for a system. Sometimes it's the system owner. Sometimes it's someone who's set aside in the department to handle things. So maybe it's someone who's overseeing the accounting software specifically in the accounting department, or the authorizing official for any changes to that system. So it could be anyone, just know the concept. All right, so then NIST structure. Know the three types of governments. So we've talked about governance in general. Well, you can have centralized governance, right, with a strong, well-informed central leadership. You can have decentralized governance, which encourages risk information sharing across the entire organization and authorities delegated to subordinate units. Then you have the hybrid, which is kind of obviously a centralized and subunits. So there's clearly defined who's handling what on the centralized organization-wide versus the subunit-wide. So that's usually how it ends up being. From there, it's more along the lines of, is the subunit authorized to make the decisions, right? Then we get into understanding the risk management methodology. Okay, and what are they? Framing, assessment, um, responding, and monitoring, right? You should know the four um, pillars or the four concepts or the four components, whatever word you want to use, of the risk management methodology. All right, then we're introduced to the risk assessment approach, right? So this is the initial introduction of the concept, which continues to grow throughout all of the domains. But basically, you're establishing a context for the assessment, right? It's informed by the risk framing component. Um, you produce a list of risks. You prioritize for the risk-based decisions, right? You have informed decision makers, so that based on this risk assessment, and then you maintain this assessment over time. So all the general concepts of the risk management approach are introduced. Then we talk about quantitative versus qualitative, right? So what is our risk methodology? How are we going to measure it, right? Asset identification evaluation. How is this concept important towards our evaluating risk? Be familiar with that. Be familiar with intangible versus tangible. All right, threats. When you talked about threats, you know them. You know, they adversely impact the confidentiality, integrity, availability. They're internal, they're external. Be familiar with threats. Vulnerabilities, any weakness in an information system. These concepts you are familiar with. I just put the general information here from the book. You should be familiar with them. Controls, what do the controls do? Right? They reduce vulnerability or likelihood of exploitation. Right? They're usually administrative, physical, technical. The control types, they're preventive, detective, corrective. The book goes over these a few times. So these concepts are very important. You have to know these. They will be on the test. Likelihood will be on the test. Impact, expected harm from a successful exploitation will be on the test in some form, right? Risk determination, it is a function of likelihood and impact. So even though there's an X here, there's a multiplication implied there, it's a function of risk, okay? Risk is determined by a function of likelihood and impact, and this is usually determined by your organization and how they like to determine risk and whether they're doing qualitatively or quantitatively. In the end, it's still a function of likelihood and impact. All right. Aggregated from multiple lower level risks. So tier one, tier two, we get into that all here in the next domain, but it's an aggregation, right? Guides prioritization and decision making. Okay. Big concept echoed throughout the entire certification domains. All right. Then domain 4 goes into the information risk management life cycle and activities. Yes, you need to know these. Focus on the steps. What are the steps? All right. Step 1, categorize information system. Step 2, select the security controls. Step 3, implement the security controls. Step 4, assess the security controls. Step 5, authorize the information system, right? Finalize the risk, compile the supporting documents, evaluate residual risk, and make acceptance decisions, authorize. So you need to be familiar with the information risk management lifecycle. I don't care what part of the IT world that you are in. You need to be familiar with it because it translates across so many other areas. For example, categorize, classify based on mission, business impact, and security objectives. This is part of a risk assessment, right? Um, we describe them, we create a register for them. It parallels the risk assessment process, right? Security controls, right? Remediating risk. This is part of that. So they all parallel each other. Information risk management lifecycle, know it. Lastly, of the stage of the step in the information risk management lifecycle is monitor secures. security controls. So again, we're monitoring, right? System changes, um, remediation. Did it work? Is it still a problem? What do we need to do to fix it? You know, update after we have fixed it. What is the current status? All of these concepts are part of the monitor secure controls, right? Reporting and metrics. It's its own section in the book, but it's part of that particular, because we talked about this, right? We talked about making sure that when we monitor and develop data from monitoring our systems, whether it's the number of incorrect logins, the number of lockouts, the number of connection attempts to a page, all of those things can be data that we can use to determine whether our controls are working correctly or working as supposed to, right? And then we develop KPIs and KRIs. There's a whole NIST on that one, right? We talked about that in the actual lecture. Then we have domain 5, risk information assessment. And this domain paralleled the NIST special publication 830, right? So there are some concepts I've placed in here from the book, but most of what will be on the exam will come from this document, which is represented throughout the study guide in this particular chapter, much more so than the rest. But that's why I wanted you to be familiar with it. So some of the reasons or the people that would be involved who could use it are all listed there. Desired outcomes is a concept that you need to know. Basically, what are the desired concept of an assessment, right? Well, we want to identify threats, we want to identify vulnerabilities, we want to identify potential impact from a threat exploitation, determine likelihood of, so know the desired outcomes of a risk assessment, right? Know the role of an internal versus external audit. High tech requires HHS to conduct periodic external HIPAA audits, right? So know that HIPAA audits are required. Assessment objectives, know what that concept means, know what the assessment object is, right? What are we doing? What exactly are we assessing, right? Then we have assessment methods. We talked about this in the lecture. We have the exam method, we have the interview method, and we have the test method. Be familiar with those 3 types. Then we went into the tier, right? So that let me not go ahead here, right? First, they talked about the actual process, right? So the information risk assessment process is 4 steps. These need to be memorized. Then we get into the tier. So memorize, prepare, conduct, communicate, maintain. Prepare, conduct, communicate, maintain. Then it'll be easier to break them down later. But before we get into the tasks associated with the steps, we need to know that you can do a risk assessment at 3 different levels of the organization, right? So this was a big update for the most recent revision. So organizational level, mission business level, information system level. Know the 3 different levels. We went into detail on this on the lecture. Right. Then we get into the 4-step risk assessment process, as shown here by the diagram from the actual SP 830 document. Then know the steps. I'm not going to go through them, the tasks. So know the tasks here. Need to know this, all right? Step 1, purpose, scope, assumptions, constraints, sources used as inputs, all right? Risk model, right? What is the assessment analysis approach? Know these concepts. Then we conduct the assessment. How do we do that? We identify threats. We identify threat events. Know that. Identify vulnerabilities and predisposed conditions. Determine the likelihood. Determine impacts. Determine risks. right? Step 3, communicate, right? Communicate risk assessment results to organizational decision makers. Share risk-related information produced during the risk assessment with appropriate organizational personnel. Then we get into step 4, maintain, right? Which obviously parallels our information lifecycle of monitoring. So maintain the assessment, right? Conduct ongoing monitoring of the risk factors, update existing risk assessment using the results. So know all of those. All right, risk response and remediation. We have identified the risk. Now we want to identify the risk response. Alternatives are accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer. So what is the risk response? Be familiar with those concepts. Tailor course of action over time by conditions. There's the flexibility factor in there. Combine responses based on situation. Evaluation of alternatives. Evaluate effectiveness and feasibility of risk responses. Consider cost, impact, and business. And so these all are factors that you need to consider when evaluating your different alternatives. Risk response decision. So based on that, what is the actual decision? Risk response implementation. This is also has a lot to do with transparency, which we'll get into earlier, but the main point here is risk response implementation. So we have all of these parts of risk response, right? So in this case, what we're implementing a selected course of action. These are all concepts from the book, so I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of the terminology. Types of controls, you're already familiar with that. Controls related to time, so preventive. So I think this is an important concept, preventive. So it's deployed before the threat occurs. So we're using a control to prevent something from happening, right? Detective, we're rolling out controls that detect if a threat is in progress, right? So this is a detection and antivirus, those types of things. Endpoint detection, SIEMs, security information event manager detection. And then we have the corrective controls. We address the damage, restore system post activity. So we're, backups, adding additional controls, those kind of things. All right, we're winding down here to the last domain. And it's interesting how this domain then reiterates a lot of things, but it reiterates it in the context of a third party. So here, let's go ahead and go through them. What is a covered entity, right? Is a health plan, healthcare clearinghouse, or provider transmitting health information in electronic form. The covered entities have direct treatment or payment relationship with the patient, right? The third party is the business associate. So this performs functions or services involving protected health information on behalf of the covered entity. That can include contractors, consultant vendors, cloud service providers, may also be subcontractors of business associates who access protected health information. Okay, so we just went through this lecture last week. I'm not going to go through too many of these things, but the privacy rule conditions, you want to consider those in regards to what's permitted and what's not permitted and how it's permitted. Know the concept of the inventory, right? So covered entities are responsible for maintaining a comprehensive and updated inventory of third parties that process, store, or transmit health information. And so then it goes to have some things that have to be included. What is the assigned coordinator? Systems and data inventory, connectivity and exchange details, service descriptions, right? What is it that they actually do for you? Define roles and responsibilities. Clearly document the responsibilities of both the internal relationship manager and the third party in internal policies and legal agreements. So all top level stuff for things that can get really in the weeds, but as cybersecurity professionals in healthcare, we need to be aware of them because here, safeguards are a big part of that. Sorry, I'm clicking on that. Safeguards, which impact undisclosed, unauthorized disclosure and permitted uses. So it's all tied together here. So be familiar with these standards and practices. Event notification has to be spelled out in the contract. Disclosure authorization. When can they actually disclose this and what can they disclose, right? Um, if something happens, what is the procedure for them disclosing to us that they have had a breach per se, or something happened that they use the data incorrectly, all right? Require the third party to disclose protected health information as specified in the contract to satisfy the covered entity's obligations, right? Includes fulfilling individual requests for access, amendments, and counting of disclosure, right? Compliance. If the third party carries out covered entity's obligation under the privacy rule, it must comply with the applicable requirements of that obligation. So it has to comply as well. The audit. Require the third party to make available its internal processes. They can be audited. Make sure that it's in there. Termination. We have the right to terminate. All of these things were covered, but make sure you're familiar with them. Subcontractors, right? They have the same restrictions and conditions. Right to terminate, right? We have the authorization termination of the contract by the covered entity. Jurisdictional requirements, right? Risk assessment, right? So the risk assessment is triggered when third-party processes, stores, or transmit protected health information. Must also be required by contractual obligations. So they are part of the risk assessment process. So as a third-party business associate, they have to be assessed in the same way internal processes are assessed by the organization. So the key agreement elements: assessment scope, notification requirements, roles and responsibilities, assessment frequency, remediation of findings. Okay, and then it goes in to talk about assessment and audit support, right? So controls must align with the covered entity's information governance and risk program. Covered entities may use HIPAA security rule as a reference, right? And then we have NIST SP 866 as our guidelines. And part of this 866 were different tables that outlined activities that were part of what should be assessed and what should be considered in an audit. So the security management process, the aligned security responsibilities, the workforce security, information access management, these things all need to be basically familiar with. Incident notification and response. So the third-party agreement must define breach notification and response expectations. So the main thing is that you need to know that third-party agreements have this spelled out in them. Okay? Chain of custody is another concept that's part of incident notification and response, right? So make sure that you're aware of the concept of chain of custody. Okay, so then we have incident response. It talks about preparation, detect and analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, post-incident activities. You should be familiar with these from other cybersecurity classes. So just know these four parts, right? Preparation, so you're preparing for the incident. Detect and analysis, incident. So you're detecting and analyzing whether it was an incident that needs to be dealt with. If it has to be dealt with, containment, eradication, recovery, post-incident active. Just be familiar with those. Then between the covered entity and the third party, right? So what is the contractual agreement, right? This must be outlined, expectations and coordination procedures for how an incident should be responded to, right? And these elements include notification point of contact, timely incident notification, agreement to cooperate. Third parties must provide reasonable assurance of timely incident reporting, enables the covered entity to initiate its own response procedures. More likely than not, you're going to have a scenario in your test that refers to how a third party should be notifying it and whether they did it correctly or not. This same concepts here: breach identification, notification, and initial response, right? Same thing here. Timely third-party notification is essential for compliance. So these are some ideas that need to be considered, subject to local state laws. So consider these in the scenarios that you have to identify and whether the entities are doing it correctly or not, and what the proper response might be. HIPAA breach notification rule, right? So be familiar with the HIPAA breach notification rule. Affected individuals, if 500 plus, what happens? How long do you have? All right, 60 days. So contractor requirements should include notification point of contact. All right, we've talked about this a few times now, right? Know the concept of notification point of contact. What is the required breach information? Responsibility for ensuring notification. Who's going to issue the notification? Excuse me, the covered entity, the third party, right? That has to be spelled out, right? And a commitment by both parties to full cooperation during the investigation. Here's the chain of custody. Know that. Establish connectivity. So then the book goes into talking about what you should consider as an organization before you connect, right? So you want to establish trust, and this can be done through a risk assessment, right? Before you even connect, you're doing a risk assessment, right? You're considering the third party's track record. You're considering other independent third party assurances. Are they part of organizations already that follow HIPAA guidelines? Limit data exchange to only required information. So know the trust component. Know the safeguards. You're already familiar with this, all right? Administrative, physical, technical, right? Implement appropriate controls, right? Know that NIST SP 866 and HIPAA security rules are guidelines to implementing these safeguards. Then you have connection agreements. So this is like a sub-agreement to the big, large agreement. How exactly are these things going to be connected? Then promoting awareness of requirements. This section was specifically about making sure that as an organization, you have certain requirements. These requirements extend into your third-party business associates, right? So it just reiterates these requirements. Be familiar with these requirements and the relationship they have with the third parties. Same thing with risk remediation, right? All of the efforts have to align between the third party and the covered entity. So both of them are responsible for remediation, okay? One of the important concepts that you need to remember here is that the organization that owns the electronic protected health information is accountable, right? But the third party or the business associate is responsible. Right? So this is usually defined clearly in the contract. Who is responsible and who's going to handle the costs? Many times it's a shared thing. Sometimes it's just the third party. So clearly the third party who had the breach is responsible, but still the organization, the covered entity, is accountable because they're the ones that are supposed to be doing the risk assessment in regards to the third party. Okay, it gets a little confusing, but just remember that the covered entity is accountable and um, the third party is responsible. I'm sorry. Okay, that comes to the end of our presentation here. I whipped through it. It's supposed to be just a quick review to bring up the concepts, refresh your memory on them. Please take the time to study the slides, especially the lecture on NIST SP 830. Okay, I at the time emphasized that was going to be an important lecture. I believe it's lecture number 23. 21 does the first two chapters of SP 830. 23 does chapter 3, where it goes through the whole risk assessment process. Okay, so the tips: study. Obviously, you need to study, but at the end of every chapter, there's definitions. Take the time to learn those definitions, right? Also, at the end of every chapter are questions. And if you're got a keen eye for this, you'll notice that I've taken a couple questions straight from the book and put them in the exam, right? So if you studied the questions in the book, you probably got those right. So please take the time to look at the questions. Practice midterms. Another one where if you're doing the practice quiz and the practice midterm, and I just put up another practice final, but that's just for the last two chapters, you'll notice that a lot of those questions seem to find their way onto the actual exam. So if you're not taking the time to do the practice midterms, you're shortchanging yourself. Do the practice quiz, do the practice midterm, do the practice final exam, please. And lastly, for this final exam, focus on the slide materials and the study guide. Okay, I'm not going to bring in any information from the XP Cyber Labs. Um, just if I lectured on it and it's in the book, you need to know it, right? Simple as that. Let's focus on the slide materials and the study guide, and especially the NIST SP 830 presentation lecture, because a lot of concepts in that particular one are concepts that are echoed throughout the rest of the domains, right? Like the risk methodology, um, risk framing the risk, responding to risk, right? All of those concepts, which are part of the NIST management risk management framework from NIST. God, I'm running NIST and risk into each other. Um, they're all kind of be in that one document. So that's why I wanted you to just focus on that one document. Okay. NIST SP 830. I know you're sick of me saying it over and over again, but when you leave this class, I want you to be familiar with that document and the concepts that are in it. Okay. So you're coming to the end of the very last lecture of CIS 41B, Healthcare Information Security and Privacy for Practitioner. Now, this class is not offered that often. You are part of a select group of people who will be eligible for this cybersecurity healthcare specialist certification. Okay, so when I graduated from Moreno Valley College, I graduated with an AS in computer programming, and I got a certificate in Java computer programming, Java language computer. So I got my degree and I got a certificate at the same time. That's what you should be doing here. You should be getting your degree and then getting your certificate at the same time. Or if you're someone who's already got a degree, then here's your pathway to just getting the healthcare specialist certificate. It's going to be a unique item to put on your actual resume, to put on your LinkedIn. So I would encourage you to make sure that you're fulfilling all the requirements so that can be part of your academic record. And congratulations to you, all right? You deserve it. We've dealt with a lot of legal concepts, a lot of um, um, government regulations, for lack of a better word, that can be just tiresome. And that's what happens when you get into the management level of cybersecurity, is that there's so much privacy and security laws that have been implemented to protect us from having our identity stolen and having people take out huge loans and credit cards and buy things by the hundreds of thousands of dollars that we have spent years of. I mean, we all probably know somebody. I know somebody who had a mortgage taken out on a house in their name when their identity was stolen. And it took years to untangle that. So this is an important role that we are going to play in our careers, and not only professionally, but also personally, you know, for our friends and our neighbors, to help them not be victims. So thank you for working with me and being part of this journey. It's been an honor. Simply, it's been an honor. I wish that we had a chance to be in person, but as I said at the beginning of this class, it's an online class, and I would not make anyone come to an online class at a specific time when it's supposed to be on your own time. And I know many of you might not even see this until right before you take your final exam. That's okay. Okay. But I will have office hours this Thursday. They'll be the last one. If anyone's interested, or if you see this before then, please come and visit me. I'd be happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. It'd be my honor. Reach out to me there. If you need a letter of recommendation, I'm very familiar with all the quality work that's being done in this class. I'd be happy to do a letter of recommendation. So thank you very much for being your instructor in this healthcare information security and privacy practitioner class. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and I wish you all the best. Good luck on the final exam and good luck on your careers in cybersecurity. Take care now.